Hello, I'm Dr. Bond. We begin another Bond report. Today we're going to speak of naming day in Eden. What do you call certain types of implants? Once again, here's the eagles in my backyard. This is the first egg we saw them hatch. They've done 3 generations now. My wife calls them George and Liberty. And we're going to discuss naming things. George and Liberty there. Naming anything is filled with pitfalls, let alone naming any commercial product. You have taste, you have plagiarism, you got foreign language, like you'll come on this perfect word and it means, up your ass in Swedish or something, and you can't use that. So what do you watch with names? Things that you can figure out easily, something that's plagiarized, that's the name of our product. I don't think that's your original idea. Or things that have other meanings in other languages, and people watch that and say, here's this, lens that's called, this is not what you're looking for. The art of medicine, once again, as Voltaire said, is murderous and conjectural. We have an ad here for the year I was born, that Harold Ridley came out with his research on his Perspex, polymethyl methacrylate, the molecule where you could make an implant. His designs were very much like someone's real lens, and we got much closer to his designs, but the materials and the experience got better. His early designs were not good at all. And how do we name these things? When I was a resident, it was most people would develop their own designs. These were a bunch of busy surgeons, and they would have a certain lens, and they would normally modestly name it after themselves. Early on, lenses were eponymous, meaning that they would name it modestly after themselves, and that would be their lens. And I'm thinking of dozens of these things. And you did that. Now here is a side view. The cornea goes up and above the eye here, and then you have the iris in here. The pupil is simply a hole that the iris surrounds, and it's simply where the iris isn't, and that's the hole that you look through. You see with the back of your eye, which is the retina. And the question here is, where do you put the implant where it'll stay? You can't just set it on top of the vitreous. The vitreous is quicksand. It'll sink back in there and it'll wind up back on the optic nerve. You have to have something holding it in place. And so they began, Harold Ridley, there was nothing back there. And the only place you could really seal one was up in front. Well, your iris moves back and forth, and you've got to have real exact sizing because these areas chafe. The iris is moving with a light, and then you try to hook something to the iris. The iris is unbelievably flimsy. It's got the structural integrity of like a wet toilet paper thing. It looks like you see a model, it's this hard plastic. It's anything but. It's spiderwebby. And you can rest something on it, but it's not a sure thing. And then, if you do your operation differently, when you take the lens out, there's a structure behind it called the posterior capsule. And the modern way to do this is to put things on top of the posterior capsule. You're back there where your lens was all along. And you haven't got all these sizing issues and these other problems. And there will be more about that. Your own lens is like an M&M peanut. The nucleus is the peanut, the cortex is the chocolate, and the sugar coating is the capsule. There's a capsule around it that the zonules, what are called, move it. The lens is to accommodate, to change its shape so you can focus at different distances. That's what goes bad as you age. The average age is 42 to start to need readers because your lens won't move as quickly. It's what focuses you at different distance, like a camera lens. And, well, the camera lens is like it more than it's like a camera lens. It's the original. And in that case, you basically do a different way of taking out the lens. When I was a resident, you took out the whole thing and you tried to put your implant up toward the front, which was the technology of the time. Later on, we begin to take it and leave that posterior capsule. So you're taking out the peanut, you're taking out the chocolate, you have to get the front part because you're going through that, but you're leaving the sugar coating back behind, and that sugar coating, which is not an overly robust tissue, it is kind of thin, is what holds your implant in place. So that will be done. Life, as Ray Bradbury said, it's trying things to see if they work, and you want to have somebody else's. Here's one going a little sideways that is getting out of place. You can see the structure. The optic is down here. There are a million ways to do this and to have them change. And the haptic is your positioning thing to hold it in place. Now, I have seen these designs hugely change and the concepts change with them during the 43 years I was in practice. And this thing was emerging technology. And you'd watch it go through both the tragic stages and the farcical stages. Gee, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? And it takes about 10 or 15 years for that to be forgotten. And you'll have another crop of people saying, oh boy, I wonder if we should try this. Well, we tried it before in my experience and it didn't go well, and let's learn from that. So, the first time is tragedy, second is farce. And these are just a modest collection of earlier lenses, as guys would put their names on them. They'd put their own names typically. And I can identify pretty much all of these lenses. There was one that was flexible called the Liska lens. And there's various designs called an artisan. There were also different things. When it began to see the anterior chamber lenses could erode into the cornea or begin to chafe or do other things in there, not good. Then we get away from sizing and they try to hook it to the iris. And there were things called the iris claw lens that was pretty much like you would anticipate. And I've got some sample claws here. You try to grab onto both sides of the iris. And one of the troubles there have been a lot of wild designs over the years, and they've all been manufactured and put in people. As the technology changes, this is done with the best of motives and trying to make things go well. But iris claw always reminded me of that. Typically, people would name them after themselves. Here we have a pretty ambitious lens, and that's a lot of extra weight there in, and it's trying to slip. This is called the Worst lens. Now, that happens to be a Dutchman whose name was Jan Worst, W-R-S-T. And these little things, he later got a third one. The little loops you see there, basically they'd hook on the iris. And that would chafe, do some other things, but it was the best you had. Now, also, if you got the iris would dilate too much, your implant would start to fall backwards. And so you had to have somebody who were pretty sure you weren't going to need to dilate, or they'd have some kind of funny lenses. Now, I'm thinking back of the old days when you'd go to meetings and pretty much all they'd talk about was you got to get my lens. And it would be the guy giving a lecture about the lens he had developed. It'd be another surgeon, older than you, that had his own place. And he had invented this lens, or it made some kind of little change to it, and then put his own name on it. And you'd go in there, and there they would be. And there'd be these guys, you'd see a knot of them, and there'd be minimum half a dozen of them standing around. I'm a kid then. They'd be smoking the cigarettes. They'd have the Miracle Fiber sport coat on, typically in a pattern like this, like you're selling cars. Cigarettes, have that carousel. They had your slide carousel so you could put it on the given thing at the meeting. And there they'd be, much less fashionable than this at the time, but there they'd be smoking their cigarettes with their slide carousel under their arm, and they'd be ready to go. Let's talk about how my lens is wonderful and all the other ones suck. And it would be very much what you did at meetings. As I said, I could probably put a name on every single one of those IOLs in that diagram. You had the haptics are the parts that position them in the eye, and the optic tends to stay about the same. And there they'd be. You'd have, if you got one, it was considerable money to have that, and you'd be proud of yourself, You'd be in there doing this, doing that. My lens is working better than yours. Oh, yeah, yes. That was a meeting in those days. And, typically they'd be in Florida, and you'd travel to Florida, and all you'd get is this conflicting stuff. Everybody would have these numbers. Oh, they did these results, and here's their series. And these people are 2020, and these people are 2030, and what happened to, there was real tragedy and there was real farce some of the time, and you'd try to go off of these claims. The real breakthrough, and I remember the day this came, my chief, who was a guy who was, how to put this, he was not overly fond of listening to nonsense, did not suffer fools gladly, and did not enjoy having his time wasted. Did not enjoy having his time wasted and was not over fond of listening to nonsense. And the day this came out, this was done by a guy named Sinsky in Las Vegas, that great hotbed of learning. Sinsky was in Santa Monica, rather, and Steve Shearing is the guy who changed it. Steve Shearing really changed that. And these were the Shearing lenses. And what they did was you had to change your surgical technique and leave that posterior capsule, Steve Shearing. The day that came out in the journals, my chief would have daily rounds, and I happened to be on those, and he walked in there saying, "My God, I wish I had thought of this. This is going to succeed." Everybody would go up and argue with him. They'd have whole meetings where they say, is it better for an anterior or posterior chamber lens? He said, this is the one that's going to work. Absolutely know that. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to learn. Do this. This will work. All those other ones are nonsense. He was absolutely right. These are the various designs. As you go in there and they're named further, and you get various things so you can see the haptic better when you operate and do some other things. There'd be design details, but the fundamental thing was you wanted to put that in the posterior chamber. That changed everything. And that took, and he knew that the day he saw that. I remember him saying, I wish I'd thought of this. Here's an IOL just up against your finger. That's actually kind of a big one. And they would have just the different patterns, but that's the rough size of them. But here's my chief. He was very much a guy that got to the quick of things. We had a corneal fellow. A fellow is a person doing extra training after his residency, so he can be an expert in a subfield of ophthalmology, in cornea or strabismus or retina or things like that. And we would have 4 corneal fellows at once. And we had one fellow that's in there, and you'd operate with the chief. And I was the first-year resident in there. And he sat there. He wasn't, as I say, fond of having his time wasted. This guy, it's kind of like a stool. You'd have sort of a piano bench arrangement. And he'd want to get this, and this guy would fuss with a microscope more or less forever. Well, my chief would sit there mentally like Bugs Bunny in some cartoon, drumming his fingers. And finally, the guy would adjust the microscope height so you're certain focus and certain this, but then you try to get this ergonomic thing where your back doesn't hurt after doing several cases, and you're doing one of these things, and about the 5th time, he made some little adjustment. Chief never even raised his voice. He said, wouldn't it be simpler, which is what he sounded, wouldn't it be simpler to just slice about a 16th of an inch off the cheeks of your ass? And I retain that to this day. You got to get an education somewhere. And in the probably 35,000 of those I ever did, when I'd fool with the stool, which I try to do a minimum amount, wouldn't it be simpler? The things you retain from your education. Anyway, those guys designed their own lenses. My chief knew that posterior chamber lens was the way to go, which it absolutely was. There was controversy about that. Well, gee, it was the posterior chamber. And I remember he'd go to meetings, and you'd see him at some meeting, and they'd say, well, gee, this AC lens is much better. What do you have? And then they'd name a bunch of guys that thought this because they had these numbers that they'd thought up in the IOLs they'd given. He'd say, well, gee, who's advocating this? And he'd say, well, God put the lens in the posterior chamber, which had sort of shut everybody up. And they didn't have anybody quite like God. It was interesting time. There was a lot of cut and thrust and personality in these things, but he turned out to be right. God is on the side of the big battalions, but it winds up being right, triumphing. Well, how do you name these things when you're through naming them, a bunch of guys naming them after themselves? This was a company thing, the Odyssey. I remember they came out with this about 2 years ago. You've got to call them something. An Odyssey, I remember thinking that's an odd thing to call a lens, because an Odyssey is a long, exhausting journey. The original one with Odysseus went 10 years. And while all ophthalmologists have been through these journeys with surgical patients that aren't doing well, nobody's longing to repeat the experience. So Odysseus didn't want to go through another Odyssey. This is the sirens and everybody. There's a lot of pitfalls you go through on your Odyssey, and you don't want an Odyssey. Now, I'm going to go through a patient here that I went through with about 9 years. And there will arise carpers that will say, oh, you were getting extra money at that because you're charging people. You're not. You do the initial surgery if you're a surgeon, and the post-op care is included in that cost, no matter how long it goes. Now, if you have a guy that you operate on and it went fine, and he's cool, and there's no problem, then he's back in every year, every 2 years to get his glaucoma checked. You charge for that. That's not directly related to the surgery. You'd be doing that anyway. But in terms of running a bill up, it's the worst thing ever because you are not going to run that bill up. That is done as part of that surgery, and you're eating that. And that's entirely fine, and that's what the job is. But I'm just saying when the guy starts to say, oh, that's the way you're charging more, it is not and isn't, and it's not just me. That's surgeons everywhere. So no backtalk about, oh, gee, you're charging more, and that's not true. And they had a lens come out recently that they called the Envy, which I thought was an interesting thing to call a lens. It had normally been a more heroic thing. And I thought, well, we're naming the lenses after deadly sins now. That's one of the 7 deadly sins, is envy. And the deadly sins are very unforgiving things. St. Jerome here, no less of a person, the guy who translated the Bible into Latin so it could be commonly understood by the average priest. There's St. Jerome, who, by the way, we're getting into multifocal lenses. We've gone beyond the simple posterior chamber lenses now into wouldn't it be cool to get something where you don't have to have reading glasses. I have implants in my eye that are multifocal. I occasionally use readers, but most of the time I don't. And even St. Jerome here doesn't like to read with his glasses. There he is helping with the Bible. But St. Jerome's, if he's had cataracts, he'd have multifocals in there. But St. Jerome was also a great connoisseur of sin. He tried to rank them. And he said that envy was the one sin that does not give the sinner even a moment of pleasure, which I thought, here was a guy who's thought some deeply about this. You're hoping to do better. Now, there's a great deal more envy in the world than its habitual practitioners think. And the greatest practitioners of envy generally refer to their own envy by the name of ethics. And there will be another talk sometime. But the word ethics is abused a lot. And a lot of the time it means jealousy. Moral indignation is jealousy with a halo a lot of the time. Well, here's the envy lens. I just thought, well, we got 7 deadly sins. Let's call something after it. The envy lens, you see everything green. Most patients get accustomed to the greenish change, but suggest that someone else is doing better, and that'll seem to help. Commonly referred to by those possessing it as ethics, the green windshield again. We next go to avarice, greed, cupidity. This is the avarice lens. Now, the old times, we would say indications. We don't need no indication. Badges, indications? We don't need no indications. This would be people you're operating on at the drop of a hat. They may or may not need it, but you say, oh, you'll need to have this operation. This is avarice. Part of the surgeon, can you charge more for an avarice lens? This is, of course, the entire point. If you've got the thing in there yourself, that's the only question worth asking. And I had a guy devise a logo that I asked for with a green S with the 2 white canes through it to the people who get a little knife happy. But this is the avarice lens. And money's taken in by all of the senses. Beauty in the eye of the beholder, well, let's put some in your eye. Double your beauty, double your fun, double your bank account. This is the avarice lens. We have the anger lens, the wrath lens. I like my anger slide so much I couldn't decide, so I put all 3 in there. But here we are. Most patients get accustomed to the reddish tinge, occasional pulsating vision fairly well. But when you talk patients with a CE to patients, you're not the one who has to supply it. Gee, you need to be a little patient. I have never said that to a patient, thinking how impatient that I am. And if I'm on the other end of that, the last thing I need to hear is I need to have a little more patience with a CE instead of a T. That's not what I came there for. Now, the Rath lens, we'll call the angular lens the Rath lens, has some distressing night vision and glare issues, real enough. And this is glare at night, glare, halos, starbursts. And so, hence the name from the psalm again, let not the sun go down upon thy wrath lens. I thought that was clever and still do. Vanity. Mere beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. And what I thought we could do with a vanity lens, the optic is inside the pupil. There's a good deal of vanity in my profession. Should this be the surgeon vanity or overweening, vainglorious? Example, we need, I had a friend of mine that would refer to a size of a guy. He worked in a men's store. And he'd describe a guy, this was a guy about 35, 48 long. We need a plus 18 smug lofty. But he'd look at a guy and say, oh yeah, 48, 48 short, medium. It was the best way to get at it. The vanity lens would be the me channel, all me all the time, 24 hours a day, no interruptions. Beauty, I'm thinking of Ricky Henderson. Ricky don't like it when Ricky can't find Ricky's limo. People refer to themselves in the third person. Is it truly third squared when you get Ricky saying his name 3 times in a sentence and you're referring to yourself in the third person? Is that third squared? That's an actual quote. Like Isaac Newton's apple, you take that small mirror that the lady had in my first vanity lens and you put that facing backwards so the retina behind that just sees itself in the mirror. So you're showing the patient at all times. You're not seeing through that, but they see a magnified image of themselves. And so, the vision's not that great. The science is a backward-placing mirror in the posterior chamber. So the patient's view of themselves is not only life-size, but is magnified. And now, through our advanced technology, that's what a retina looks like. That's your optic nerve. In fact, that guy's probably got a little glaucoma, because that's a very big disc in that nerve. And once again, vanity. There's the idea. It wasn't confined to ladies. I don't mean to imply that. I had a guy in there. We have the lust lens. Now, how do you have a lust lens? I remember thinking this. Visible light is only part of the electromagnetic spectrum. That's a small part. You have radio and electricity and gamma waves and whatever, UV, infrared. Why? Who wants to be stuck with just plain old visible light only? Wouldn't it be cool to see more of the electromagnetic spectrum? They did this, and so with a lust lens, this is one of those things in old-time comic books where the science fiction is anticipating the real thing, where this is a thing to say, see through ladies' clothing, do things like that with your lust lens. Give you some x-ray vision. People could wear the special glasses or not. Give the patients what they want, and they'll be back. You're differently, so this is making that come true. The Star Trek things, they designed cell phones based on those Star Trek communicators. The guys who invented those flip phones will tell you they thought that was cool. Give the patients what they want and they'll be back. So you've got the x-ray specs from old comics. Now, a caveat that I would give the surgeon in planning the lust lens is generally you have things you can give patients as handouts where they're deciding on what lens you want. So the lust lens would probably be a sound idea to put your patient education marketing materials in a different drawer so you won't mix that up. Closure, however, I want this one, is expected to be rapid, and there will be times when you need to manage the patient's expectations fairly early, meaning to say, and push, mix, and match. So they've got one that they'll see a little better out of. You've got an x-ray thing going, you'll see some fractures. There'll be times you want to cover that eye. And I call that the so-called NBE. The gluttony lens. Now here we have the glutton. There's another deadly sin. This will require a much larger incision. You got to guard against this tendency to swell, particularly inside the eye, particularly horizontally. And it needs to be ordered not only with a dioptric power, but once again, the adjectival phrase, in the manner of men's clothing sizes. Gee, we want a plus 19 Portly. These are powers for those lenses. Plus 19 Portly, a plus 22.5 well upholstered. These would be typical lens sizes. So it'd be what's called a sulcus lens. If your capsule's broken, you can stick this in what's called the sulcus up in there, and I won't go to a bunch of anatomy, but you have a very large diameter, very soft material, very rounded edges. So it's what we call a secondary lens. This particular case is about to shade into the Lust lens with Boudreau and Dugas. The Sloth lens, I didn't know how a lens would be lazy. It would be very easy to implant, but you'd have to watch for its tendency to go horizontal. And we have haptics to position it, long ones, often inserted upside down, and it would have 3 haptics, and you would refer to the haptics as toes. Check out these haptics. I just wanted to throw that in there. You lose one sense. The others are said to become enhanced, and this is often why people with no sense of humor tend to get inflated in their sense of self-importance. I think this is a real science here and needs to be watched. Now, lifestyle lenses, what they call the guide for the perplexed. The bottom one is where you get what you don't want. You get some halos, some starburst. You can generally manage that with pupil size. And the brain, very adaptable in pretty much everybody, does get adjusted to that. But there's one where you don't get what you do want. And that is the top one there. And they were sold with a certain amount of snake oil. So since we really, really want this to be true, me included, this is going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. And you're now fairly easy to fool. So I had about 60 of these in. And people do okay because there's a lot of other ways to pseudo-accommodate. You can do it with pupil sizes. There's some various distances. Nature is very adaptable. The brain will do different things. And you can have some pseudo-accommodation. Thinking of the movie here, Cool Hand Luke. And we did that. If you remember the boss man, Strother Martin. And what we have here is a failure to accommodate. And no matter how much you really, really wished for this to be true, it wasn't happening. What we did have there was a failure to accommodate. And so what this lens had, you had to put it in carefully, and it had hinges, which you can see on the slide. Those hinges are back toward the end of the optic, and it was slanting forward, doing some other things. And it made logical sense. It just kind of didn't work. Now, what we have there is a failure to accommodate. So I would have called that the Strother Martin lens, which is the actor who played the boss man. And then, this was a beautiful thing with this, you got to get your mind right. You need to learn to neuro-adapt. Now, this was taking place in a fictional Southern prison, and neuro was given the full value, neuro. What you have here is you need to neuro-adapt. You got to get your mind right. And so, this was interesting. You'd watch a patient go through kind of the Kubler-Ross stages here, or the 5 stages of the pseudo-accommodative sciences. And we had names for this, which I would just call neuroeducation, but they neuroaggravation, neurofrustration, neurosurrender, neuroresignation. It was what they called it was different, but that was what it was. And basically, psychologically, what we have here is you're doubling down. Well, this would work if you just did it right, if you just applied yourself, if you just practiced. If you did other things, it's got to be you that's not doing this. It can't be the technology. It's got to be you. You're just not trying hard enough. So as you double down, I'm reminded of a statistic recently. Say the crime rate is going through the roof in a given city. My God, these crime statistics are horrendous. What can we do about them? Have you learned nothing from me? Have you been watching me? What can we do? It's so simple. You simply redefine crime. And we talk about this in roundsmanship. If you don't get the right answer, you're just not asking the right question. Redefine the thing to fit what you want. Tony and Junior talking, used this one before. Kids robbed a poker game, they've killed him. This is the 3rd season. And Junior's talking to Tony, said, I said that kid was stupid. And Tony says, I talked to his mother. She said he had a learning disability or something. And Junior said, that's what stupid is, right? Well, That is what stupid is. As we get some more names, Louis-Ferdinand Céline wrote 2 masterpieces, Journey to the End of the Night and Death on the Installment Plan. So we have here what I call the Céline lens. I did this on what might be the nicest gentleman ever. And I saw him probably every week, then every month for about 8 or 9 years. And I tried every single thing that I knew to make this nice gentleman, who I had a crystal lens in, Céline lens in, to accommodate. And he was 20/20 everywhere else. He was perfect with that. He just still had to wear his readers, which, he hadn't, but she paid the extra money to get the accommodating lens. And he was in there. He was the nicest guy ever, but you would just be drained after talking to this guy because you're just not getting there. Everything I heard from friends, I tried. Everything I'd go to meetings and try. I'd bring him up to other guys that were famous lecturers about these topics and try. I literally tried my damnedest. The guy died about 8 years out. I never did get where I wanted to go. So we have not only the Céline lens, because what you had there, I always felt like after that nice gentleman was leaving, was Death on the Installment Plan. You were getting a little more there, one of Céline's titles, just a little bit of death served to you in these little moments. And then I started another name. Is this the Prometheus lens, perhaps? You've given fire to mortals, Zeus sentences to be chained to a rock, and every day in Prometheus's case, but in my case, for a while every week, then every month, eagle comes in there and eats your liver, and you grow a new one, and it felt like that. You're there, and this nice guy comes in there, and you're trying this and you're trying that, but every month he eats your liver, and it feels like that, and comes back out. He never made you feel like that. We could consider, actually, Prometheus to be the first organ donor. I mean, I'd never, I guess to donate one, somebody has to get it, but if you're a donor, it doesn't matter who there's no recipient, but you still donated. So I think that's the first organ donor, whatever the intention. Once again, Winston Churchill, critical and baffling situations, best to recur to first principles, simple action. But the thing I wanted to say, H.G. Wells said this, I'd like to go ahead of Father Time, a lot of the time with a scythe of my own. And I would clear up a lot of these things, Once again, Marcus Aurelius, closer a man comes to a calm mind, the closer he comes to strength. But my favorite there is Orson Welles, one of the all-time quotes. I guess a happy ending depends on where you stop your story. We had a 20/20 guy there. I'd stopped the story before we got to this, but just a big disappointment with that. Thank you very much. Please watch further bond reports. Been a pleasure. Thank you.